In a quiet Vermont town, a young mechanic girl restores an abandoned 1930s tractor, expecting nothing more than rust and busted bolts. But hidden deep inside the engine block, she discovers a World War II medal and a name she's never heard but somehow already knows. What begins as a simple restoration becomes a journey into family, legacy, and love left unspoken. This powerful story of how a mechanic girl restores a forgotten 1930s tractor and uncovers her own father's past will move you in ways you never expected. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. Willa Dalton cherished her Sunday mornings more than anything else in the world. Tucked away in the sleepy hills of northern Vermont, in a town where time moved slower than the clouds, Willa found solace in the quiet hum of her family's barn. During the week, her hands were always deep in engine grease, tuning up snowmobiles and fixing farm trucks for folks around town. But Sundays were different. Those were the days she tinkered for herself. Willa wasn't your typical 27-year-old. She'd rather rebuild a carburetor than go dancing. Her idea of peace was the rhythmic clink of a socket wrench under the barn rafters, her old mutt buddy lounging at her feet. That particular morning, the first frost of October still clung to the grass. The sky had that soft gray hue that made the world feel gentle, like it hadn't quite woken up yet. Willa tugged on her grandfather's denim jacket, patted Buddy's side, and stepped into the barn where something peculiar had arrived just 2 days before a rusted-out 1930s tractor, towed in from a forgotten farmstead up near the ridge. She had no idea that what was hidden inside that engine block would connect her to a piece of history, and a man she never knew. Willa didn't know what made her start with the engine block first. Maybe it was the way the early morning light hit the rust just right, making it shimmer like something alive. Or maybe it was Buddy the way he sniffed around the old tractor's rear wheel, then sat, staring at her with those patient, knowing eyes, like he was waiting for her to uncover something more than just corroded metal. The tractor itself was a relic, an old Alice Chalmers Model U, battered and skeletal, like it had weathered both time and war. It had arrived with no paperwork, no story. Just a call from an older gentleman up near the ridgeline, offering to donate it for parts. "She's too far gone," he'd said, "but I figured maybe you could make something of her." Willa always liked a challenge. She rolled up her sleeves and pulled the chain hoist into place. The smell of old fuel and iron filled the barn, that peculiar scent of forgotten things. As she unbolted the rusted casing, flakes of oxidized metal fell like ashes to the concrete floor. Inside, the pistons were seized, everything caked in decades of grime, but it wasn't the mechanical decay that made her stop. It was the glint of something that didn't belong. Willa leaned in, squinting into the heart of the engine, tucked behind a bent valve, wedged so deep it could have easily been missed, was a small round object. She reached in slowly, her fingers trembling as they grazed cold brass. She pulled it free and gasped. A medal, a war medal, round, weathered, and etched with the unmistakable insignia of the USA's Army. An eagle clutched arrows and olive branches in its talons. On the back, barely legible through the tarnish, was a name and a serial number. Willa's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a spare part someone had forgotten. This had been placed there, intentionally. She wiped the grime gently off the back and read aloud in a whisper. "CPL, Thomas R., Langston, 121st Infantry." She stared at the medal in her palm, the weight of it suddenly far heavier than brass. Buddy let out a soft whimper, as if sensing the shift in the room. Willa sat down slowly on the shop stool, still holding the medal. Her mind racing. Why would a war medal be hidden inside the engine block of a tractor and not just dropped, but lodged deep, protected, preserved? She glanced at the tractor again, suddenly seeing it not as a broken machine, but as a time capsule, a witness, a vault that had been guarding a story no one had told. And something else was gnawing at her now. The name. Langston. She'd heard that name before. Willa jumped off the stool and rummaged through the pile of old titles and repair slips she kept in a shoebox under the workbench. Most of them were for snowmobiles or lawn tractors. But then she found it. A yellowed envelope. No return address. Just one line, written in shaky penmanship. Belongs to Langston. Please fix her right. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a request, a final one. Maybe a message left for her not by chance, but by intention. She looked again at the medal. It wasn't just a token of service. It was a legacy. And it had been buried, quietly, inside an engine built before she was born. Willa felt something stir deep in her chest more than curiosity. It was responsibility, as if the weight of someone's past had been placed in her hands, asking not to be repaired, but remembered. She stood slowly, the medal still in her grip. This wasn't just about restoring a machine anymore. This was about restoring a memory. And somewhere out there, perhaps in the hills, or in some fading obituary, was a man whose story had waited decades to be told. That night, Willa couldn't sleep. She left the barn light on, the medal resting gently in an old cigar box beside her bed. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it again, its tarnished surface, the name etched into the back, and that envelope. Belongs to Langston. By sunrise, her mind was made up. She loaded up Buddy into her old pickup and drove toward the address scribbled in faint pencil on the back of the envelope. It led her past winding roads, leaf-littered fields, and a stretch of broken fence line that hadn't seen a cow in years. Just before the road turned to gravel, she saw the mailbox. Langston. The letters were chipped and fading. She pulled into the driveway, heart pounding. The house looked like time had barely touched it, white paint peeling at the corners, a creaky porch swing swaying even without wind. She knocked twice, waited. Nothing. Then, just as she turned to leave, the door creaked open. An older woman, maybe in her 80s, stood behind the screen. Her silver hair was pulled into a low bun, her eyes sharp despite the years. Yes, she asked, voice wary but kind. Willa stepped forward, holding the cigar box in both hands like an offering. Ma'am, I found something, in a tractor, one that was dropped off at my shop last week. I think it belonged to someone in your family. The woman didn't answer at first. Her gaze fell to the box. Her lips parted slightly, just enough to let the silence breathe. Then she opened the screen door. Inside. The house smelled like cinnamon and old cedar. A wood stove crackled in the corner. Willa followed her to the kitchen, where she set the box on the table with care. The woman opened it slowly, her fingers trembling as she lifted the medal out into the light. Her eyes filled with tears almost instantly. "My brother," she whispered. "Tommy." Willa's breath caught. She hadn't expected this. Not the closeness, not the grief that still lived, untouched, after so many decades. "He went to war in 1943, the woman continued, her voice softer now. "Europe. He drove supply trucks. Said he always wanted to be behind the wheel of something bigger than the farm's tractor." She gave a faint, watery smile. That old Alice was his favorite, called it Red Molly. Willa swallowed hard. The tractor. The metal was inside the engine block, buried deep, like he'd hidden it there. The woman nodded slowly. He came back different, quiet. Wouldn't talk about the war. Spent his days fixing that tractor, even when it didn't need fixing. She paused. Then one day, he just left. Disappeared. The tractor stayed in the barn for years. My nephew hauled it away last month, said it was junk. Willa felt the sting of tears rise behind her eyes. I don't think he meant to leave it behind, she said gently. I think he meant for someone to find it. Someday. The old woman reached across the table and placed her hand over Willa's. And you did. They sat in silence for a while, the metal gleaming faintly between them, as if even it understood the weight of being found. Then the woman stood and disappeared into a back room. She returned moments later with a faded photo, sepia-toned, edges frayed. It was a young man in uniform, standing beside a shiny red tractor. His smile was crooked, his eyes unmistakable. That's Tommy, she said, and that's Red Molly. Willa stared at the photo, then at the metal. Somehow, without ever knowing him, she felt like she'd just met someone important, someone who had carried his burden in silence and chosen to pass it on, not as a cry for help, but as a quiet request. Don't forget me. And Willa knew, deep down, she never would. Willa drove home in silence. The roads she had taken hundreds of times before now felt different, like they belonged to someone else. Like she was returning not just from a visit, but from a chapter that had been waiting in a drawer somewhere, unopened for decades. Back in the barn, the tractor stood quietly under a thin veil of dust. Its wheels were frozen in place, rust painting its body like scars from a life it had endured without complaint. But Willa no longer saw it as scrap metal. She saw it as a story, a memory that had been entrusted to her. She approached it slowly, running her hand along the curved fender. Red Molly, she murmured. The name sounded strange on her tongue, but right in the air, like it had always belonged there. She didn't sleep that night either. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the cold barn floor, the war medal resting in her palm, the photograph of Tommy Langston tucked into the flap of her notebook. She read everything she could about the 121st Infantry, where they'd gone, what they'd seen. She searched military records, old town bulletins, even letters archived in the library's dusty basement. She pieced together what little remained of a man who had once come home, but never truly returned. And the more she learned, the more she understood something she hadn't wanted to admit before. She was lonely. Not in the I need someone kind of way, but in the I need to matter to something bigger than myself kind of way. Willa had always fixed things, machines, engines, busted tools left behind by careless hands. But she'd never felt like her work lasted. Never felt like anything she built meant more than the moment it was used. But now, sitting in the quiet with Buddy curled beside her, she realized this tractor did matter, not just because it was old, but because someone had chosen to trust it with something sacred, a medal, a name, a past. And now, she rose to her feet, suddenly filled with purpose. Over the next few days, Willa poured herself into the restoration. She worked with a reverence she'd never felt before. Every bolt, every weld, every coat of primer became a conversation between past and present. She whispered to Red Molly as she worked, like talking to a stubborn old friend who needed convincing. Buddy stayed close, like he knew something was happening, not just to the machine, but to Willa herself. She sourced parts from old salvage yards, called in favors from mechanics she hadn't spoken to in years. She taught herself forgotten techniques from manuals published before her father was even born. She didn't care how long it took. She wasn't fixing a tractor anymore. She was restoring a man's memory. And slowly, As the paint returned to red and the steel began to shine again, something else changed too. Willa started to forgive herself. For not finishing college, for pushing people away, for always feeling like she didn't belong anywhere but under a truck or inside a quiet barn. Now, she saw that maybe her place had always been here, not just because she could repair engines, but because she could hear what others ignored, because she listened. On the 10th night, just before turning in, she stood back and looked at Red Molly in the glow of the barn lights. It wasn't finished, but it was alive again. And in the reflection of the polished side panel, she saw herself not the tired, solitary girl who'd spent years avoiding mirrors, but someone new, someone stronger, someone who had finally become part of something that mattered. It was a Thursday morning when the email came. Willa had just finished wiping her hands on a rag, engine oil smudging her forearm, when she noticed the notification blinking on her cracked phone screen. The subject line read, "Inquiry regarding Restoration Local Veterans Museum." She blinked. The message was short, formal, but filled with interest. Someone at the Vermont Historical Veterans Center had heard through a friend of a friend, or maybe a mechanic's blog she forgot she once posted on about a young woman restoring a 1930s tractor linked to a World War II veteran. They wanted to know if she'd be willing to speak with them. Willa stared at the screen, heart thudding. This wasn't her kind of thing. She wasn't a speaker. She barely liked talking on the phone, let alone presenting to a room full of strangers. But something told her this mattered. Not for her, for Tommy. She agreed to meet. The museum was tucked between a library and a fire station in a town she hadn't visited since high school. When she walked in, still wearing her flannel shirt and work boots, she felt like an imposter among the polished displays and quiet reverence. But the director, a kind man named Mr. Conway, greeted her with warmth and curiosity. "I hear you brought a ghost back to life," he said with a grin. Willa chuckled nervously. "Just fixed a tractor." He shook his head. "From what I understand, you uncovered a soldier's legacy. That's more than mechanics. That's history." They sat in a back office, where Willa laid out the photographs, the medal, and the copy of the envelope with Tommy's name, Mr. Conway listened intently as she shared the story how she'd found the medal in the engine block, how she'd met Tommy's sister, how Red Molly had become more than just rusted steel. When she finished, he leaned back slowly, eyes glassy. This is exactly why we built this place," he said. "Not just to remember battles and dates, but to honor the quiet ones, the ones who came back and never said a word." Then came the question that stopped her cold. "Would you consider donating the tractor? Once you finish her?" Willa's breath caught. She looked down at her hands, still stained with oil and effort. Red Molly had become a part of her each bolt and welled a piece of her healing. Letting go felt impossible. But then she remembered the look on Tommy's sister's face when she held the medal, the way her voice shook when she said, "That's my brother." This wasn't just Willa's story. It never had been. She nodded slowly. "I'll finish her right," she said. "And when I do, she's yours." Word spread quickly. Local papers picked it up first. Young mechanic unearths Weint Tuan. History. Then a regional news station reached out for an interview. Willa turned most of them down. But the story had its own legs now. Letters started arriving at the shop. Veterans, grandchildren of soldiers, people she'd never met. Writing to say thank you. One woman sent her a dog tag from her father's uniform. Another mailed a faded photograph of her grandfather beside a tractor almost identical to Red Molly. And then something unexpected happened. A high school in the next county reached out and asked if Willa would consider mentoring students teaching basic mechanics and preservation techniques. "You made this real," the teacher wrote. Our kids need to learn that history isn't just in books. It's under our feet, in barns, in old engines. Willa was stunned. She'd always seen herself as the girl who hid in the corner of the barn, fixing things no one noticed. Now, she was being asked to teach, to lead, and maybe, just maybe, to inspire. That night, sitting beside Red Molly with Buddy snoring at her feet, Willa stared at the glowing ember in the wood stove and whispered to the quiet air, "I think you'd be proud. Tommy?" The machine sat silent, but somehow she knew. The night before the dedication ceremony, it rained hard. The old barn creaked under the weight of the wind, and thunder rolled across the Vermont hills like distant artillery. Willa couldn't sleep. Red Molly sat polished and perfect under the lamplight, waiting. Her restoration was complete, every bolt tightened, every gear humming smooth. She looked like she had just rolled off a 1937 assembly line. But Willa, she didn't feel complete. She paced the floor, Buddy's ears flicking as she moved. Something was stirring in her chest, an ache she couldn't shake. And that's when she found it. An old shoebox tucked beneath a false floorboard near her father's tool cabinet, one she'd never noticed before. She pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. All addressed to Willa Mae Dalton. All signed with the same looping, careful hand. Thomas R. Langston. Her breath caught. Hands trembling. She pulled out the first envelope. The postmark read, April 1953. Long after the war. Long after Tommy had supposedly disappeared. She read, Dear Willa Mae, I don't know if your mama will ever give you these, but I hope someday, if life is kind, you'll read my words. I met you once. You were just a baby then. I held you in my arms for 10 minutes before the storm rolled in and the world pulled me back under. But you smiled. You looked straight at me and smiled like you knew me. Willa dropped the letter into her lap. Tears blurred her vision. She reached for the next one, then another, each filled with stories, Tommy's nightmares, his love for engines, his regrets. But one thing was constant in every single letter. He wrote to her, not her mother, not his sister, her. I'm no father, he wrote once, never earned the right. But if someday you find me buried in rust or silence, I want you to know I tried. I left my medal in the place I loved most. Maybe you'll find it. Maybe you'll understand. Her chest ached as the realization crashed down on her like the thunder outside. Tommy wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was her father. Willa doubled over on the barn floor, the weight of a lifetime of unanswered questions finally unraveling. Her mother had never told her, never mentioned his name, said he died in the war, never came back. But he had come back, and he'd stayed close, writing, hoping, trusting that one day she might find what he left behind. And she had, through grease, through rust, through that engine block and the echoes it carried. Red Molly hadn't just brought her a story, it had brought her home. She spent the rest of the night reading every single letter by the light of a single bulb. The barn felt different now, like it was holding her. And when the morning sun pierced through the cracked wooden slats, Willa stood up slowly, shoulders straighter, chest fuller. She tucked the final letter into her jacket pocket, patted Buddy's head, and whispered, Let's take Dad for one last ride. Later that day, in front of a quiet crowd at the Veterans Museum, Willa drove Red Molly up the gravel path with the grace of a parade float. The war medal hung from the rear view. Her hand rested steady on the throttle. As she stepped down, people clapped, but Willa didn't speak. Instead, she opened her jacket and gently placed the last letter, folded with care, into the display case beside the tractor. The plaque read, "Restored with honor by Willa Dalton, daughter of Corporal Thomas R. Langston." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Tears followed. And Willa, standing in the center of it all, finally felt what she had been searching for her entire life. Belonging? The wind was gentle that afternoon. Willa stood alone in the small memorial garden behind the museum. Red Molly parked just a few feet away under the shade of a sugar maple. Her hand rested on the polished fender, cool to the touch, even in the autumn sun. She had traced every inch of that machine with her bare hands, and now it felt like part of her. Visitors came and went. Some took photos, some stood in silence, but most cried. And Willa didn't say much. She didn't need to, because the story had already been told. The tractor spoke for itself now, its fresh coat of red paint, the war medal on proud display, and the final letter from a father to his daughter, read aloud earlier that morning by the museum director with a cracked voice and misted eyes. Willa watched as a boy no older than 10 stood in front of Red Molly, clutching the hand of his grandfather, a veteran in a faded uniform. The boy looked up and whispered, "He was brave." "Huh." His grandfather nodded slowly. "Yes." And so was she. Willa turned away, suddenly overwhelmed. She walked past the stone wall, where fallen leaves rustled at her boots, and sat on a worn bench that faced the fields beyond town, the same hills her father once knew. Once drove across in that very tractor before the war turned everything into silence. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out one final item, a spark plug, old, scorched, and cracked down the side. The very first part she'd removed from Red Molly on that cold October morning weeks ago. She'd kept it in her pocket ever since, not really knowing why. But now, she did. It was broken. Yes. But it had started something, and in its brokenness, it had become something more, the spark that led her home. She held it tight in her fist, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Thank you, Dad." Not Corporal Langston, not the ghost of a name in a file, not the stranger in a photograph. Her father. He had left her a trail not made of words, but of metal, grease, and silence. And in following it, she had rebuilt more than a tractor. She had rebuilt herself, for the first time in her life. Willa wasn't hiding behind machines. She wasn't just fixing other people's problems. She wasn't just the girl in the corner of the barn. She was a daughter. She was a storyteller. And she was someone who had listened when the past whispered through rust and memory. Before leaving, Willa placed the old spark plug gently at the base of Red Molly's front wheel. A quiet offering. A reminder that even broken things still hold value. Even forgotten things still matter. The months that followed changed everything. Willa was invited to speak at schools, veterans groups, and mechanic training programs. Not because she was a celebrity, but because she was real. She shared not just the story of Red Molly, but the deeper truth behind it. We don't fix things just to make them run. Sometimes, we fix them because in doing so, they fix us. Young girls lined up after her talks to ask how to change oil. Elderly men brought her their old medals to clean. Mothers hugged her without saying a word. And Willa never stopped working in her barn. But now, every machine she touched felt like a continuation of something larger, a legacy of listening, of honoring, of making space for the things time tried to erase. Red Molly stayed at the museum. But every so often, Willa would visit. She'd run her fingers over the smooth metal, smile at the faint smell of grease still lingering, and remind herself that sometimes a girl with a wrench can carry the weight of a forgotten war. Sometimes It takes someone who was never meant to find the story, to be the one who finally tells it right. And sometimes, the most powerful engines aren't the ones that roar, but the ones that whisper. I remember, some stories don't begin with a hero. They begin with silence, with rust, with a girl in a barn, just trying to fix something broken. Willa Dalton didn't set out to change anything. She didn't know her father's name. She didn't have a plan. She just followed what felt right. And in doing so, she unearthed something greater than history. She found love buried in silence. She found healing in gears and grease. She found a voice she didn't know she had. The lesson is simple, but powerful. You don't have to be loud to be brave. You don't need a uniform to carry a legacy. And you don't have to be whole to help something else become complete. Sometimes, the greatest restoration doesn't happen to the machine in front of us. It happens inside. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories waiting to be discovered. Click to continue the journey, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe every life deserves to be remembered.